Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Ken Evans, and I'm the lead for our refined fuels business here at DTN. And it's a pleasure for me to have somebody with me that shares the passion of being able to improve supply chains across the oil and gas value chain. Now, interestingly enough, Drew and I come from different ends of the chain here a little bit, but I think you're going to have a great conversation today, and I'm really excited for it. But Drew, before we get into that, why don't you just give everybody a couple minutes of your background and what you're doing? So,
Yeah, absolutely. I had started out in the trading space during college, and then made my way to World Fuel Services, where I got lucky enough to work directly for the CEO there and took on more of an operational role, where I was observing our different business units, and that brought me to a fuel terminal in Sitco, Lockport, Illinois. At which point I began to see a lot of the issues that I was focused on in midstream fuel distribution, especially from a cash flow perspective, all started to make sense when I saw what drivers were going through as they went through the rack process. And that not only entailed order entry errors at the rack, but then the actual handing of papers to a back office who was trying to amend any errors that occurred during that order process. And I was trying to get to the bottom of why does it take us 3 days to get an invoice out of the door, and in an instant, it all really started to make sense. And since then, I've been pulling on the strings and just really developing a deep understanding of not only how fragmented everything is across suppliers, carriers, and terminals, but we've seen such a deep focus in the industry on just infrastructure and compliance, and innovation as a result has had to take kind of a back seat. And so that's what we're here to solve, because as APIs come to market and as technology begins to be adopted by our industry, the opportunities to drive a more effective supply chain are absolutely massive. And I can't wait to take that on with DTN.
yeah, well, that's pretty amazing, Drew. That it's I started a few decades before you, I think, in this space, but it's interesting that that ability to get beyond paper. It's just amazing how much paper still involved in the supply chain, right? And unfortunately, this is a particular segment of the industry that I think has been a real laggard in terms of being able to get the investment they've needed to be able to close some of those gaps on a digital basis. So, but let's before we dive into that, why don't we just ground the conversation a little bit and talk about what some of the biggest challenges are that the industry is facing today. Then, so
I think that a lot of the biggest challenges that the industry faces are the dynamics of the industry itself. This is one of the most complex supply chains in the world. Absolutely razor thin margins. I mean, we're talking about, fractions of pennies on the gallon, and it's incredibly competitive. And so I would say, just from a biggest challenge, is we've kind of gotten into a state of accepting operational inefficiencies as that's just always how we've done it. But as we begin to kind of decompress what that actually means, unannounced drivers at a terminal cost the industry about $15 per load. So when terminals don't know who's coming in or what that driver is going to pull, drivers are waiting at the racks stall out, dispatchers have to intervene, and this just creates unavoidable time and labor waste. And to that end, drivers manually typing these order details by compartment into the rack keypad is a massive issue, not only from a timing perspective, but from the errors and the size of the consequence of the errors that we're seeing at the rack. And then beyond that, we've already hit on it, but just the paper-based BOL transcription, that's about $6 a year. So if you take, $15 per load for unannounced drivers, about $6 per load for manual data entry errors at the rack, and $6 for those paper-based BOLs, that's about $600 million annually as an impact per year in our industry. And beyond that, we're talking about so much wasted time. So I'm completely convinced that there is an absolute revenue driver where we can get these fleets and these various stakeholders to operate more efficiently. And I think that's an even bigger opportunity than $600 million in annual cost savings.
yeah, because largely what you're talking about is just sort of the back end stuff. It doesn't talk about the forward opportunities. And if you go back to some basic supply chain principles, right, they talk about any one of those points of friction ends up costing, variability. It induces a variable signal into that supply chain. And that's what ultimately you have to calculate for things like safety stock and everything else, right? Across the whole value chain. So
Absolutely. And I think in a lot of ways, we're riding this wave of the industry itself getting more complex. So you used to have about 70% of the industry on branded contracts. That's now flipped to about 70% of unbranded contracts. So you've got more suppliers sharing the same terminal. So a BOL's origin no longer shows whose fuel it actually was or which allocation that it should hit. And the origin of the BOL itself no longer really tells the suppliers that full story. So the final destination has become a major point, a major blind spot within our industry.
yeah, and I think that's a good segue into sort of my next question is why has it been so difficult for the industry to fix these problems? Because you just pointed out one aspect was most of the systems we operate in, even DTN's systems, we've been around for 4 decades now, serving this industry. Um, it was designed for that different model, right, in the past. But what are some of the other things that make it so difficult for the industry, you think, to fix these problems? I mean,
I
so.
think, it's a couple things, but this is the backbone of the global economy. And it started many decades ago. And its origins were in very vertically integrated networks where one company controlled everything. Over time, as these companies sought out margin or what have you, they began to sell off different divisions within their supply chain. And this led to this massive ecosystem of everyone passing around different assets. Fundamentally, not a lot has changed. We're still transacting the same products from the same fixed assets to the same delivery stations. But over time, that disintegration began to take shape, and these systems are just fundamentally not connected. And so, without that synchronization, everyone's using different identifiers effectively for the same load. And we're just now at a point where terminals are beginning to leverage APIs to share real-time information. And it's also what we talked about before. There's kind of been this aspect of focus on infrastructure and compliance, and we need to kind of put innovation into the same conversation as two very important facets of the supply chain.
Right, and that whole aspect of they were all vertically integrated, and so the businesses worked well together. But we never, and they were at that time probably digitally integrated for the day, right? But
Right.
but now when every gallon that's moved at Iraq, is changing hands on average of three or more times, right? That just introduces a whole new set of complexity, right, in
Absolutely.
that whole conversation.
And I
So.
don't think that carriers were appreciated for the importance of what they add to this supply chain. And the result of that is now that everyone's working kind of in this reactive mode, trying to piece data together manually, where we really should be gathering all this data and providing important insights for how to operate more efficiently.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I'm coming up. Today's my 2 year anniversary actually here at DTN when we're recording this, and I
Congrats.
think back to the conversation of day one when I walked in and sort of had my first real briefing on the full strategy of the business. Um, that was one of the first highlights I pointed out was I said there's two elements here that were missing. There was one, the carriers, right? You're missing their key stakeholder in this whole value chain, but then the second one was the regulatory agencies. And now I was thinking at the time, I was thinking tax because that's sort of my background as well. But you come at it from just the DOT perspective, right? I mean, and the like. So,
Absolutely. And drivers are still collecting that sheet of paper after they load. And, we've talked about allocations as our gold standard for the entire industry, but from a carrier lens, it's kind of funny. They just don't want their drivers having to collect those sheets of paper anymore. And I think we can get them over that line.
yeah, that's amazing when you think about, there's sort of the oxymoron of government efficiency, right? And so we're still relying we're still relying on paper-based systems in this area of the business, and how much more visibility. That's a whole nother conversation. You and I will have to have is how can we actually take this and actually go help some of those partners at the state, local levels to say, hey, how can you get better visibility into your overall supply chain, doing this? But
Absolutely.
that's a great, I think, segue into the next question I wanted to ask you though. So this is, I think where the integration comes in. And for those of you that aren't aware yet, DTN, well, Tandem is now part of DTN as of, well, it's been a little over a month now. So it's
Just hit a month.
just at a month. So that's pretty cool. But how does combining our ecosystem and the new workflow you've envisioned here finally address some of these challenges? So
At the end of the day, we're trying to establish digital connectivity between carriers and terminals 50 million times a year for all of these transactions. DTN already provides visibility to the terminal side, from allocations to credit and product availability, as well as even with the Guardian system and the hardware integration there. The integration with Tandem extends that visibility into the carrier and dispatch systems, which were previously this missing link that we've already talked about. But a huge component in all of this is the industry itself is so unbelievably sensitive. And we say that everyone's operating off of old, antiquated technology. I don't necessarily believe that's the case. These dispatch modules are working just fine for the carriers in a lot of instances. It's more a matter of just establishing that level of connectivity to these pain points that we've already discussed, where if we can just provide communication from the dispatcher to the rack and then back again, you're unfolding 80% of the value, I believe, within that supply chain, and able to distribute that back to the stakeholders. So with DTN and Tandem, for the first time, the industry gets end-to-end load visibility from order to allocation to the driver to the rack itself, and then showcasing that final destination. So we're eliminating the sources of those $600 million problems annually by pre-validating drivers before their arrival, syncing the load IDs across these various systems, making sure the right loading number is used every single time, eliminating that manual data entry, and digitizing and validating that BOL information in real time. So this integration effectively connects every critical point of failure right now in the loading process. And it also unlocks that long-awaited shift that we talked about at Sigma to getting to the point of actually reserving a load at the terminal, which again, that is industry gold standard.
yeah, I remember that's been a real challenge here. So and it is some interesting conversations that we had at Sigma, and I was shocked at how some very senior members have been working in this industry for decades. Came up and said that they were shocked, and they asked the question, why haven't we dealt with this before, right? What's been the barrier? But the other one was that, let's talk about, and a few of the conversations were with the actual carriers, the leaders of those organizations, and I still remember. Let's see if you'll remember that conversation. But I still remember a couple of them that said, "Name me one other industry, right, that actually sends a truck all the way to the rack and or to a warehouse or a pickup or anything, commits that before even knowing that the product's going to be there, right? That type of situation." Right. So
Absolutely. Right. I
so
mean, spot on. And go
go
ahead.
ahead. Just why don't you unpack a little bit about what you've seen? What does this really mean from a carrier perspective then?
From
So
a carrier perspective, I mean, we again have to hit on how thin these margins are and how inefficient these operations are on account of, what's going on at the rack. So a driver constantly is heading from their dispatch facility to the loading rack. They wait in line at the loading rack, and then they type in all their order details, only to find out that they don't have that allocation, or that the inventory at the terminal can't support that load. And I just think that's absolutely crazy. And what we've learned in the last month, further to that point, is carriers eat that first 1 hour of demurrage fees. So that is absolute pure margin that we could go attack and distribute back to the carriers. Um, and so, I mean, what are the carriers getting from this? It's a level of visibility that they've
right,
otherwise never had and never thought could be possible, because they're operating under this premise that, a certain amount of demurrage, a certain amount of order entry errors every year, it's okay, I can still be profitable. And we're trying to show them you could be 5 times more profitable if you just focus on 2 or 3 main areas of your supply chain that have otherwise, just haven't gotten the time of day.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating to me because one of the conversations I remember was also they talked about just simply the driver experience. You just said, drivers, what do they like to do? They like to drive, right? And to sit there and all that wait time, to waiting in line and waiting at the gate and then have to manage all this paperwork and everything else. That's not what really excites them, about
No,
doing the job, right?
it's
So,
actually, yeah, I mean, it's a great point. It's quite the contrary. In our industry, in fuel distribution, 30% of every fuel truck driver out there right now is already within retirement age. So, I mean, we have a massive driver shortage issue, and I've been to 50 terminals in the last 8 months, met with countless drivers, and I see it every single time. The drivers are senior. They've been doing it for a couple of decades, over 1 million miles of safe driving, which is just absolutely incredible. But
mhm.
they talk constantly about how no one else wants to jump into this industry. And a huge component of that is, I mean, would you want to show up to a job where you're compensated by the load, but the load's not there when you arrive? I wouldn't.
Yeah, no, you're right. And then there was a whole one of the last sessions at Sigma, which unfortunately, a lot of people are already traveling out, but I popped in there and they were talking about the fact that, this whole driver experience and what companies are having to do to recruit drivers. And the other aspect of it is these are drivers that, the training thresholds and the certification thresholds are much higher than most of the places you find in the industry and other industries, right? So,
Absolutely. I went to that session as well. That 30% number is exactly where that came from.
yeah, no, that's pretty great, and what people don't realize as well is just the visibility. There is that safety aspect as well, which I hate to bring up all the geopolitics and everything else, but I've had conversations with people in other countries, which I'm pretty fascinated to think about. Is that there's where else do you have 8,000 gallons of highly explosive combustible materials rolling around, right? That
Yep.
type of thing, and you want to make sure that's in good, safe, capable hands, right? And you
Yeah,
know where it's
absolutely.
at, right? So,
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is also you've got these dispatch teams who their job should be to dispatch and schedule loads as effectively as possible. Instead, they're just on the phone helping drivers try to get through the rack. And I think it's unbelievably important,
yeah,
given what you just said, that everyone knows exactly how they're being routed, where they're going, and how they're going to get there.
right.
And as a result of that, with what Tandem and DTN are doing together, there's a massive opportunity for dispatch teams to actually focus on dispatch. And yeah, we're going to be getting drivers more efficiently through those terminals, helping with that job retention and satisfaction. And on the other end of that, you've got clean, structured data coming out of the rack. And I know there's a lot that carriers can do with that as well.
Yeah, that's probably a good segue. You mentioned a couple times here, but what's in it for the terminals and the suppliers, and that's something I know that when we decided to get together, it was really focused on what can we, it was a good enough deal just to talk about what made sense for the carriers and those end buyers and what we could do there. But it's even better when you start thinking about and what is in it for really the terminals and the suppliers even further upstream. So,
Yeah. Well, I would say that as demand plateaus, customer service on a terminal front is becoming more and more imperative. And a lot of the most forward-thinking customers that we get to work with are the ones who are focused on just that, and that's why Tandem resonates so well for them. And they're also looking long term. So as we're front running orders to the terminal, 24, 12 hours in advance, they're now able to better forecast what the loads for the next day are going to look like. As a result of that, inventory optimization plays a crucial role into why both terminals and suppliers are going to want to do this. And then just the improved efficiency of operations. If you're saving 1 minute per load and you're doing 300 loads a day, that's 5 hours of additional rack capacity. Who doesn't want that?
yeah, I mean, that kind of gets back to the whole digital abundance aspect, right? If we can make better utilization of existing assets, then, we don't have to invest more to build, with those precious resources to build more terminals and take up more space and have more inventory, holding capacity and those types of issues, right? But I
Absolutely.
remember the other one was the supplier. We were having a meeting a couple months ago with one of the CIOs that I know from one of the largest suppliers in the country, and we had a very good meeting, but we were at the end of a great meeting, went out to a nice dinner, and at the end I just asked the open-ended question. I said, hey, if you were advising me what should I look at, where's one area you could look at? And it was amazing to me that he actually brought up unannounced, this whole movement towards more of an order-based loading process, right? And could we actually get the reservations? And he started riffing on how much time they spend on doing invoice reconciliation, right? And,
Yeah.
and the things, right? Because somebody fat fingered a number or something, right? From
Right.
what they'd said, right? So it was,
Absolutely. Or even, from a supplier lens, just having, something to help with the compliance of branded versus unbranded product taking. That's a huge impact in the industry. If you can't maintain that, if you don't have a clean, accurate view into who's taking what and where it's going, you're not going to be able to maintain, the compliance of that very well. And that leads to a lot of dollars at the end of the day.
yeah. So let's take a step back, and I sort of opened up that a little bit to talk about order-based loading and the transformation that's possible here. But why don't we take a step back and just look at the bigger picture? And you've been having a lot of conversations over the last month, explaining to people that you're now part of DTN, and you've had a lot of follow-up conversations. But what are you getting a good picture of the opportunity here for fully connecting that downstream fuel chain? So,
I mean, I would say the opportunity is to bring fuels to be as efficient of a supply chain as anything else, because we already deal with the most complexity. I'm completely convinced of that. We just need that connective tissue to operate as a unit. And I think all of that starts with order-based loading coming to the market at scale. We've talked about how sensitive the ecosystem is. We don't want to change dispatch workflows. We don't want to have to change a driver's loading process. We're now at a point where, with just one change of a keystroke, drivers can obtain an order-based load and not have to type in all of those details. And that is absolutely massive for everyone. And the drivers themselves love it. So drivers are really just validating the load, no manually dialing for gallons anymore. I know we can get to a point where, there's an integration from all the way from the retail tank to the rack itself with a digital copy of that transaction end to end. And all of that's going to lead to load reservations. And that's going to be industry driven. We need to partner with folks to actually make that happen. But we have everything we need to get to that point. And again, it's as you said, like, it's not the craziest concept in the world that, a driver is sent to pick something up and it's actually there. And DTN and Tandem can do that.
and going back to even I start think back to your original trading days, right? If you had just a couple more hours of insight into forward visibility into what the demand signals were going to be, what could you have done with that as a trader, right? So that's
Absolutely. And expanding on that point, we look at how all of these fuel trucks, one's on the east side of town, one's on the west side, they're constantly crossing one another. And just from a logistical perspective, there's a lot of ways once, these orders are starting to flow through that you can help optimize the profitability of everyone's operations within that network. But again, it just comes down to actually creating that connective tissue between everyone, having the data all flowing in harmony. And that's the responsibility of DTN and Tandem, is to be that industry neutral provider, that source of truth who helps everyone to operate to their fullest potential.
No, I'm excited for the opportunity, and that's part of the reason why it was. I think you and I have known each other for what, about 21 months, 21 months or something like that now.
Yeah,
And I remember when we first met, I was like, okay, sort of Drew's tilting a windmill here, but it was, but when I heard other customers start challenging me just not too long after that conversation, say, hey, what are you doing right in this area? What are you doing in that area? It was pretty exciting. So I absolutely think that we've got a great opportunity here. But Drew, I just want to give you a final opportunity to what's the final closing comment you'd like to leave with the industry? Anybody's listening here. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we just don't have to accept these long-standing beliefs that, blind spots are blind spots, and that's just how the fuel industry works. And I put that onus on myself, and working with DTN, I know that we can carry this industry forward, because with unified real-time visibility across suppliers, carriers, and terminals, we're eliminating hundreds of millions of dollars in inefficiencies annually. And I am also, again, a firm believer that we're going to drive revenue for our stakeholders as well.
Okay, well, that's a great way to close it up here, Drew. I want to thank you for your time, and for everybody listening to the podcast, please come back. We got a few new additions lined up. I look forward to talking to my buddy over at Sigma, and getting some great insight from them on where the industry's going. So thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Ken.